The crack of the leather belt was a sound the whole town of Silver Bow ignored. Folks just looked down at their boots, drowning out the muffled cries with cheap whiskey and the clatter of poker chips. They all knew Martha Jenkins took out her bitter, twisted life on her daughter, Clara. They knew, and they did nothing. But the frontier is a funny place. Deliverance rarely comes riding in on a white horse with a shiny badge. Sometimes, salvation steps out of the blizzard wrapped in wolfskin, standing 6'4", with eyes as cold as a frozen creek. He didn't come to town looking for a bride. He came for flour and salt. But the mountain man took one look at the bruised girl bleeding in the snow, and the entire destiny of the Dakota Territory shifted on its axis. The winter of 1881 hit the mining camp of Silver Bow like a hammer against an anvil. The wind howled down through the jagged peaks, carrying a bitter frost that froze the mud in the streets and turned the window panes of the Jenkins boarding house opaque with ice. Inside, the heat from the potbelly stove barely reached the corners of the dining room, but it was enough to keep the rowdy miners drinking until their pockets were empty. Clara Jenkins knelt on the splintered floorboards, a bristle brush gripped tightly in her raw, chapped hands. She scrubbed at a stain of spilled tobacco juice and cheap rye, her muscles burning from 14 hours of uninterrupted labor. She was 19, though her frail frame and haunted, wide gray eyes made her look much younger. Her faded calico dress hung loosely on her, patched at the elbows and frayed at the hem. "You missed a spot, you useless girl." The shrill, venomous voice cracked through the din of the room. Clara flinched instinctively, her shoulders drawing up toward her ears. Martha Jenkins, her mother, stood over her. Martha was a woman hardened by the frontier and soured by her own bad choices. Her face was a map of deep lines and perpetual scowls. Her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin over her skull. In her right hand, she held the braided leather quirt she usually kept behind the bar for unruly drunks. But more often than not, its target was Clara. "I'm sorry, Ma," Clara whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring fire and the laughter of the miners. "I'll get it." "You're just like your no-good father," Martha spat, her eyes flashing with a sudden irrational fury. She raised the quirt. The room didn't go silent. The men like Elias Reed and old Doc Carson, merely averted their gaze. It was a daily ritual in Silver Bow. No one intervened in family business. The leather bit into Clara's shoulder through the thin fabric of her dress. She gasped, a sharp intake of breath, but refused to cry out. Crying only made Martha hit harder. "Get out back and fetch more wood," Martha commanded, kicking Clara's scrub bucket so dirty water sloshed over the floor Clara had just cleaned. "And if you drop a single log, you won't eat for 3 days. Go!" Clara scrambled to her feet, clutching her stinging shoulder, and hurried toward the back door. She threw a thin, threadbare shawl over her shoulders and stepped out into the freezing dusk. The cold was an immediate physical shock, stealing the breath from her lungs. The snow was knee-deep in the alleyway behind the boarding house. She trudged toward the woodpile, tears finally spilling over her lashes and freezing on her pale cheeks. She felt so entirely alone. She had dreamed of escaping, of running away to the cities out east, but she had no money, no winter coat, and nowhere to go. If she ran, the winter would kill her before Martha's hired trackers even found her. As she reached for a heavy piece of split pine, a shadow detached itself from the side of the building. Clara gasped, dropping the wood and backing up against the icy logs. He was the largest man she had ever seen. He was dressed head to toe in heavy animal hides, buckskin, and thick fur, with snow dusting his broad shoulders. A thick, dark beard obscured most of his face, but beneath the brim of his weathered slouch hat, his eyes locked onto hers. They were a striking, startling blue, like the ice at the core of a glacier. He carried a heavy Sharps rifle casually in one hand, but his posture wasn't threatening. He was utterly still. "You're bleeding." His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement of fact. Clara reached up and touched her cheek, realizing a stray end of the quirt had caught her face. Her fingers came away red. She looked back at the giant of a man, terrified. Mountain men came down from the high peaks only a few times a year. They were wild, feral creatures, known to be as savage as the grizzly bears they hunted. "Please," Clara whispered, her teeth chattering from the cold and the fear. "Don't tell my mother I was talking to you. Please, She'll kill me. The man didn't move. His blue eyes scanned her face, dropping to the bruise forming on her jaw, the way she favored her left shoulder, the inadequate shawl wrapped around her shivering frame. For a long, terrifying moment, the wind seemed to hold its breath. I won't tell her, he finally said. Before Clara could respond, the heavy wooden door of the kitchen banged open. Martha stood in the doorway, framed by the yellow lamplight, her face twisted in rage. What in the hell is taking so long? Martha barked, squinting into the gloom. Then she saw the massive man standing near the woodpile. She took a step back, her bravado faltering for a fraction of a second. Who are you? What are you doing out here with my daughter? The mountain man shifted his gaze from Clara to Martha. The temperature in the alley seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Name's Caleb Wyatt, he said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the howling wind. I came for supplies. Seems your daughter is doing the work of a mule in weather that'd kill a horse. Martha's eyes narrowed, the fear immediately replaced by indignant rage. Mind your own business, mountain trash. She's my blood and she'll do as she's told. Clara, get inside. I'm going to skin you alive for dawdling with a stranger. Clara whimpered, grabbing an armful of wood and rushing toward the door. As she passed Martha, the older woman raised her hand and struck Clara hard across the back of the head. Clara stumbled, dropping the wood onto the snowy porch, falling to her knees. Martha raised the quirt again, ready to bring it down on the girl's spine. But the blow never landed. A large, gloved hand shot out of the darkness, gripping Martha's wrist with the stopping power of a steel trap. Caleb Wyatt had moved faster than a man his size had any right to. That's enough, Caleb said softly. The quietness of his tone was far more terrifying than a shout. Martha struggled, her eyes widening in panic as the grip on her wrist tightened just enough to grind the bones together. Let go of me. Sheriff Brody is right inside. I'll have you hanged. Call him, Caleb offered, his voice devoid of emotion. But the belt drops. Martha dropped the leather quirt. Caleb released her hand. He looked down at Clara, who was curled into a ball on the snowy porch, trembling violently. How much? Caleb asked, looking back up at Martha. Martha rubbed her wrist, her face a mask of confusion. How much what? For her. Caleb pointed a massive leather-clad finger at Clara. She's wearing your patience, and you're wearing her hide. You run a business. Everything has a price. What's hers? The silence that followed Caleb Wyatt's question was heavy and suffocating. Clara lay on the icy wood of the porch, her breath hitching in her throat. She stared at the snow boots of the mountain man, her mind struggling to process what was happening. Was he buying her? Like a sack of flour? Like a draft horse? A new, icy terror gripped her heart. To be owned by her mother was a known hell. To be carried off into the wild by a stranger was a terror she couldn't fathom. Martha let out a sharp, mocking laugh, though her eyes remained guarded. You're crazy. You think you can just walk out of the woods and buy a human being? This ain't the slave days, and she's my daughter. She's your punching bag, Caleb corrected, his tone flat. And she owes you a debt for room and board, doesn't she? You complain loud enough in town about how much she costs you to keep. I heard you down at the general store not an hour ago. Martha's eyes darted toward the warm light spilling from the doorway. She was a greedy woman, driven by a desperate need to keep her failing boarding house afloat. The silver veins in the nearby mines were drying up, and her patrons were drinking less and leaving more tabs open. She owes me for 19 years of feeding her ungrateful mouth, Martha sneered, calculating. You don't have that kind of money, trapper. Caleb slowly reached into the deep pocket of his wolfskin coat. He pulled out a heavy leather drawstring pouch. The dull, muffled clink of heavy metal hitting metal was unmistakable. He tossed it casually. It landed in the snow at Martha's feet with a heavy thud. There's 40 ounces of pure river-panned gold in there, Caleb said. Weighs out to roughly $800. That covers her debt and buys her a train ticket east, or whatever you choose to tell the town. But she comes with me. Now, Martha's breath caught. $800 was an absolute fortune. It was enough to pay off the mortgage on the boarding house and live comfortably for years. She dropped to her knees in the snow, her greedy fingers clawing at the leather pouch. She loosened the string, and the dim light caught the dull, rich yellow gleam of gold nuggets and dust. Clara watched her mother's face. She saw the total, Instant abandonment in Martha's eyes. 19 years of abuse, culminating in a swift, cold sale. "Take her," Martha said, standing up and clutching the pouch to her chest like a newborn infant. She didn't even look at Clara. "She's worthless anyway. Can't cook a decent stew, always crying. She's your problem now." Caleb didn't look at the older woman. He knelt beside Clara. His massive presence blocked the bitter wind. Up close, Clara smelled wood smoke, pine needles, and clean leather. "Can you walk?" he asked. Clara nodded slowly, too terrified to speak. Caleb reached out and gently gripped her uninjured shoulder, pulling her to her feet with no more effort than lifting a rag doll. "We need a piece of paper," Caleb said to Martha, who was already turning toward the door. "Legal and binding. A marriage certificate. I won't have you or Sheriff Brody riding up my mountain in the spring claiming I kidnapped her." Martha scoffed. "Judge Harmon is drinking at the corner table inside. You want a wedding, you pay him yourself." 10 minutes later, Clara stood in the corner of the noisy saloon, shivering violently in her damp dress. Judge Harmon, a red-faced man who smelled of sour mash, hastily scribbled on a piece of official territory parchment. Caleb stood beside her, an immovable mountain of a man. He hadn't asked her if she wanted this. He had simply commanded it. The few miners who watched the spectacle merely whispered among themselves. Gold had changed hands. The mountain man had bought the boarding house drudge. It was frontier justice, simple and brutal. "Do you, Caleb Wyatt, take this woman?" Judge Harmon slurred through the vows, eager to get back to his poker game. "I do," Caleb said. "And do you, Clara Jenkins, take this man?" Clara hesitated. She looked at her mother, who was standing by the bar, weighing a gold nugget in her hand with a sickening smile. She looked at Caleb, whose face gave absolutely nothing away. She was trapped between the devil she knew and the wild beast she didn't. "I do," she whispered, her voice cracking. Harmon slammed a stamp onto the paper, signed and witnessed. "You're man and wife. May God have mercy on you both." Caleb took the paper, folded it carefully, and tucked it into his coat. He then took off his heavy wolfskin coat. Underneath, he wore a thick wool sweater. He draped the enormous, incredibly warm fur coat over Clara's shoulders. The weight of it almost buckled her knees, but the warmth was immediate and overwhelming. "Let's go," he said. He didn't wait for her. He walked out the front doors of the saloon. Clara, swallowing her sob, scurried after him, practically disappearing inside the massive fur coat. Outside, a large black draft horse was hitched to a post, breathing plumes of white steam into the freezing night. It was saddled and packed heavy with supplies. Caleb effortlessly lifted Clara by the waist and set her sideways on the saddle. He untied the reins and swung up behind her. He didn't hold her inappropriately. His arms acted as cages on either side of her to keep her from falling, his hands firmly grasping the reins. "Hold on," he instructed. With a click of his tongue, the great black beast surged forward. They rode out of Silver Bow, leaving the meager lights and the sound of the tin piano behind them. They headed straight into the teeth of the blizzard, ascending into the dark, towering peaks of the mountains. Clara pressed her face into the wolf skin, tears finally flowing freely. She had been sold. She was a captive. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the harsh grip, the rough hands, the brutality she had been taught to expect from the world. But as the horse climbed higher into the frozen wilderness, Caleb Wyatt did nothing but shield her from the wind with his broad chest, riding in total, impenetrable silence. The journey lasted for what felt like days, though Clara knew it was only a matter of hours. The black horse trudged relentlessly through snowdrifts that reached its chest, guided by Caleb's steady hands. Clara drifted in and out of a freezing, exhausted sleep, her body utterly drained from the day's trauma and the biting cold. Whenever she started to slip to the side, a massive, gentle hand would right her, supporting her weight without a word. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale, grayish-blue light over the jagged peaks when the horse finally crested a steep ridge. Before them lay a hidden valley, sheltered on three sides by towering granite cliffs and densely packed with ancient, snow-draped pine trees. The wind, which had howled furiously the entire ride, died down to a soft, mournful whisper as they descended into the trees. In the center of a small clearing stood a cabin, It wasn't the crude, drafty shack Clara had envisioned. It was a sturdy, beautifully constructed log home, the timbers thick and tightly fitted, with a stone chimney that looked like it had been grown from the earth itself. Caleb brought the horse to a halt. He dismounted smoothly and turned to Clara. He reached up, grasped her waist, and lowered her to the snow. Her legs were completely numb, and her knees buckled instantly. Before she could hit the ground, Caleb caught her, scooping her up into his arms as easily as if she were a child. Panic flared in Clara's chest. She pushed weakly against his solid shoulder. "I can walk," she lied, her teeth chattering. "No, you can't," he replied calmly. He carried her up the sturdy wooden steps and kicked the heavy oak door open. Inside, the cabin was freezing, but it was incredibly clean and well organized. He carried her to a large bed in the corner, a bed framed in heavy timber and covered in thick bear and elk hides. He set her down gently. "Stay under the coat," Caleb ordered. He immediately turned his back to her, striding over to the massive stone hearth. He struck a match, and within minutes, a roaring fire cast a warm, golden glow across the room. Clara huddled under the heavy wolfskin coat, watching him with wide, fearful eyes. She analyzed his every movement, waiting for the moment his demeanor would shift, waiting for the anger to surface. That was how men worked, wasn't it? They were calm until they wanted something, and violent when they didn't get it. But Caleb moved with a quiet, deliberate efficiency. He went outside, tended to his horse, brought in his supplies, and then filled a cast-iron kettle with snow to melt over the fire. He didn't speak to her. He didn't demand anything. An hour later, the cabin was comfortably warm. Caleb poured hot water into a tin basin, grabbed a clean white flour sack cloth, and walked over to the bed. Clara shrank back against the headboard, pulling the coat tightly up to her chin. Caleb stopped a few feet away. He set the basin on a small wooden stool. "Your face is crusted with blood," he said, his voice low. "And your shoulder is bleeding through your dress. It needs to be cleaned, or it will fester." "I can do it myself," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Caleb nodded once. He handed her the cloth and turned his back, walking over to the stove to tend to a pot of beans and cured pork he had started. Clara cautiously slipped out from under the coat. She winced as she pulled the torn fabric of her dress down to expose her shoulder. The welt from Martha's quirt was deep, angry, and oozing. She dipped the cloth in the warm water and hissed through her teeth as she dabbed at the wound. "Why did you do it?" Clara asked, the words spilling out before she could stop them. The silence in the cabin was too heavy, and her anxiety was eating her alive. Caleb didn't turn around. He continued stirring the pot. "Do what?" "Buy me. Bring me here. You don't even know me." Caleb was quiet for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the bubbling of the stew. Finally, he turned. His massive frame was silhouetted by the firelight, making him look even more imposing. "I don't abide cruelty," he said simply. "And a man gets tired of the quiet, that's all." Clara didn't believe him. $800 in gold wasn't spent on a whim because a man was lonely or didn't like cruelty. There was something else. Over the next 3 days, Clara's physical wounds began to heal, but her mental exhaustion grew. Caleb left early every morning with his rifle, returning at dusk with fresh game. He left her alone in the cabin. He never raised his voice. He never demanded she cook or clean, though she did so out of deeply ingrained habit and fear. At night, he slept on a bedroll on the floor near the fire, leaving the large bed entirely to her. He treated her with a distant, almost reverent respect that confused her more than abuse would have. On the 4th day, a violent blizzard struck the valley, trapping them both inside. The snow piled high against the windows, sealing them off from the rest of the world. While Caleb was out in the attached shed chopping more firewood, Clara decided to clean the top shelf of a large wooden bookshelf in the corner of the room. She stood on a stool, dusting the spines of surprisingly well-worn books, Shakespeare, old histories, journals. As she moved a thick leather-bound volume, a small square object slipped from behind it and clattered to the floor. Clara climbed down and picked it up. It was a daguerreotype, framed in tarnished silver. A photograph. She turned it over and looked at the image. The breath rushed out of her lungs as if she had been punched. It was a picture of two men standing shoulder to shoulder in front of a mining claim. One was a much younger, clean-shaven Caleb Wyatt. He was smiling, looking relaxed. The man standing next to him had his arm thrown around Caleb's shoulder. He was tall, with light hair and striking, wide gray eyes. Eyes that Clara saw every time she looked in the mirror. It was her father. Martha had always told Clara her father was a worthless drifter who ran off with a soiled dove to San Francisco when Clara was a baby. Martha claimed she hated Clara because she was the spitting image of the coward who abandoned them. But here he was, standing with the mountain man who had just bought her. Clara turned the metal frame over. Etched into the back of the silver were two lines of text: Elias Jenkins and Caleb Wyatt. The silver strike of 65. Brothers in blood, until the end. Clara's hands began to shake violently. The photograph slipped from her fingers, hitting the floorboards with a sharp clack. The door to the shed opened, and Caleb stepped inside, carrying an armful of wood. He stopped dead in his tracks. He saw Clara, her face completely drained of color, staring at him, and then he saw the daguerreotype lying face up on the floor between them. The quiet mountain man closed his eyes, let out a long, heavy sigh, and dropped the firewood. "I see you found it," Caleb said, his voice carrying a weight that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Clara backed away until her shoulders hit the rough logs of the cabin wall. You knew him. You knew my father." Caleb stepped into the room, kicking the door shut against the howling blizzard. He looked at Clara, and for the first time, the cold ice in his blue eyes melted, replaced by a profound, agonizing sorrow. "I didn't just know him, Clara," Caleb said softly. "I was there the night your mother murdered him." The wind shrieked against the thick glass of the cabin window, but inside, the only sound was the ragged, uneven drawing of Clara's breath. She remained backed against the rough-hewn logs of the wall, the tarnished silver daguerreotype lying on the floorboards like a discarded weapon. Caleb Wyatt did not move toward her. He understood the feral panic of a cornered animal, and right now, Clara's wide, terrified gray eyes mirrored the deer he hunted in the high snows. Slowly, Caleb reached down and picked up the dropped firewood, stacking it meticulously by the hearth. He moved with a deliberate, unthreatening slowness, giving Clara the space to process the impossible words he had just spoken. "My mother," Clara choked out, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "You're lying. She's a cruel woman, but she's no killer. She said my father ran off to San Francisco with a parlor girl. She said he left us with nothing." Caleb took off his heavy leather gloves, tossing them onto the wooden table. He walked over to the cast-iron stove, poured a measure of strong, black coffee into a tin mug, and set it gently on the edge of the table nearest to Clara. "Your mother," Caleb began, his voice a low, steady rumble that cut through the howling storm outside, "is a liar of the highest order. And she didn't just take your father's life, she stole your entire history." Clara crept forward, her hands trembling so violently she had to wrap both of them around the warm tin mug just to keep it from spilling. "Tell me, if you're going to keep me locked up in this valley, you owe me the truth." Caleb sat heavily in a high-backed wooden chair by the fire. He stared into the flames, the dancing orange light casting deep shadows across the rugged topography of his face. "It was the winter of '66, Caleb said, his gaze fixed on a past Clara couldn't see. "Elias and I were barely men, but we had the fever. The gold fever. We pushed deep into the Dakota territory, past where the mapmakers stopped drawing lines. We staked a claim up near Whispering Ridge. It was a hard patch of earth, but Elias had a nose for quartz veins. We struck a pocket of pale gold and silver so rich you could carve it out with a pocket knife." Clara listened, captivated despite her fear. Her father wasn't a drifter. He was a prospector, a successful one. "Elias was a good man," Caleb continued, a profound sadness softening his harsh features. "But he was blind when it came to Martha. He sent for her as soon as we struck the vein, brought her out to the settlement. He wanted to use the gold to buy a massive spread of ranch land in Montana. He wanted to build a legacy for you. You were just a tiny thing then, barely walking." "I don't remember any of this," Clara whispered, staring into her dark coffee. "You wouldn't," Caleb replied. "Martha didn't want a ranch. She hated the dirt, hated the cold, hated the work. She wanted high society in the East. She demanded Elias sell the claim to a mining conglomerate. When he refused, the fighting started. It was vicious. But I never thought she'd turn to poison. Clara's head snapped up. Poison? Caleb nodded slowly. Arsenic. Tasteless in a heavy stew or a cup of bitter coffee. She did it slow. Claimed he caught consumption. I was up at the ridge, working the deep shaft for 3 weeks. When I came down to the settlement, Elias was already turning blue, coughing up blood. I knew it wasn't a lung sickness. I found the empty rat poison tin in Martha's trunk. Why didn't you go to the law? Clara asked, her voice cracking with indignant grief for a father she had never known. Caleb let out a harsh, humorless laugh. The law? The law in that camp was a deputy named Brody. The same Sheriff Brody who drinks free whiskey in your mother's boarding house today. Martha had already promised Brody a hefty cut of the strike if he helped her get rid of me. While Elias was taking his last breaths, he grabbed my shirt. He told me to take you and run. He knew what Martha was. Caleb paused, his jaw tightening so hard the muscles jumped beneath his thick beard. I failed him, Caleb admitted, the words heavy with a 19-year-old guilt. Brody and 3 hired guns ambushed me outside the cabin before I could reach you. They shot me twice, once in the leg, once in the ribs. I went over the bluffs into the freezing rapids of the Snake River. They assumed I drowned. But you lived, Clara said softly, her anger at him fully eclipsed by the tragedy of his tale. Barely. An Arapaho trapping party pulled me from the ice. It took me a year to walk properly again. When I finally made it back to the settlement, it was gone. Burned to the ground. Martha had cashed out the surface gold, set fire to the old cabin, and told the territory authorities that Caleb Wyatt murdered his partner and perished in a fire trying to cover it up. She told everyone the baby you died in the blaze too. Clara's breath hitched. She erased you. She erased me. I spent the last 18 years in the high timber, Caleb said, finally looking away from the fire and meeting Clara's gaze. I thought my best friend's daughter was dead. Until I walked into Silver Bow for flour last week and saw a girl with Elias Jenkins' gray eyes being whipped in an alleyway. The silence returned to the cabin, but it was no longer menacing. It was the solemn silence of a shared grave. Clara looked at the massive, intimidating mountain man, and the monstrous image Martha had painted of the world outside her boarding house shattered completely. The man sitting across from her wasn't a captor who had purchased a slave. He was a guardian who had paid a king's ransom to finally fulfill a dying man's promise. Clara set the tin mug down on the table. She walked slowly across the room, stopping just inches from where Caleb sat. Tentatively, her small, calloused hand reached out and rested on his broad, wool-clad shoulder. Caleb didn't flinch, but she felt the deep, shuddering breath he took at her touch. "You didn't buy me," Clara whispered, tears spilling freely down her cheeks, washing away the last of the terrified girl she used to be. "You rescued me. I'm sorry it took 19 years, Clara," he said, his voice breaking. "You're here now," she replied, and for the first time in her brutal, tragic life, Clara Jenkins felt entirely, unconditionally safe. The brutal grip of the winter slowly loosened over the next 3 months. The howling blizzards that had battered the cabin gave way to crisp, bright mornings and the steady, musical sound of melting ice rushing down the granite faces of the valley. As the snow receded, revealing vibrant patches of green meadow grass and the bright purple heads of wild columbine, the ice around Clara's heart thawed in equal measure. Life in the hidden valley was hard, but it possessed a rhythm and a peace Clara had never known. The boarding house in Silver Bow had been a purgatory of screaming miners, broken glass, and the constant, looming threat of her mother's leather quirt. Here, the loudest sound was the wind in the ancient pines and the occasional distant bugle of a bull elk. Caleb never pressed her for affection, nor did he act like a husband who had purchased a bride. He treated the hastily scrawled marriage certificate tucked inside his journal for exactly what it was: a legal shield to prevent Martha from legally dragging Clara back to hell. But as the days grew longer, the dynamic between them shifted. Clara refused to be idle. She was done being a victim. "If I'm going to live in these mountains, I need to know how to survive them," she told Caleb one bright April morning, pointing to the Winchester 1873 repeating rifle leaning near the door. Caleb had looked at her, his icy blue eyes assessing the newfound steel in her spine. He nodded. He taught her how to stand, how to brace the heavy stock against her bruised shoulder, and how to control her breathing. He stood behind her, his massive frame radiating warmth, his large hands gently guiding her posture. When she hit her first target, a tin can 70 yards away, she let out a cry of triumph and instinctively turned, throwing her arms around Caleb's waist. He froze for a second, unaccustomed to the sudden, joyful embrace, before his heavy arms slowly wrapped around her shoulders, holding her securely. It was a turning point. The lingering ghost of Elias Jenkins had brought them together, but the quiet, steadfast respect they built day by day was entirely their own. Clara found herself watching Caleb as he chopped wood, admiring the raw, unyielding strength of him. Caleb, in turn, found himself rushing back from his trap lines just to see her smile when he walked through the heavy oak door. By the time late May arrived, the pass leading down to Silver Bow was completely clear of snow. Clara was outside, kneeling by the rushing creek that ran 50 yards from the cabin, washing a batch of cotton shirts. She wrung the fabric out, humming a soft tune she hadn't realized she remembered. She felt strong. She had gained weight, the hollows of her cheeks filling out, her pale skin baked into a healthy, golden tan by the high-altitude sun. She looked up toward the ridge, expecting to see Caleb's large black horse descending from the tree line. He had gone out early to check the far perimeter of the valley. Instead of Caleb, a flock of ravens suddenly exploded from the tree canopy a half-mile down the trail, their harsh caws echoing sharply against the canyon walls. Clara stood up, her instincts sharpening. Caleb had taught her how to read the woods. Birds didn't scatter like that for a wandering deer. They scattered for a predator. Down in Silver Bow, the spring thaw had brought more than just warmer weather. It had brought a reckoning. When Martha Jenkins had greedily counted the gold Caleb Wyatt threw at her feet back in January, she was too blinded by the fortune to look closely. It wasn't until April, when she went to the assayer's office in the next county over to trade some of the raw nuggets for banknotes, that the trap snapped shut. The assayer, an old-timer who knew the geology of the Dakotas like the back of his hand, had examined the gold under a loupe. "This is rare dirt, Martha," the assayer had said. "Pale gold threaded through white quartz. I haven't seen a strike like this in 20 years. Not since that dead claim Elias Jenkins and his partner staked up on Whispering Ridge." The words had hit Martha like a physical blow. The mountain man in the wolfskin coat, the towering size, the striking blue eyes. She had been too panicked, too eager to sell Clara, to recognize the ghost standing in her alleyway. Caleb Wyatt was alive, and if he had this gold, it meant he had returned to the hidden shaft Elias had discovered right before he died. The shaft Martha had never been able to locate before she burned the settlement. Martha didn't want Clara back. She wanted the rest of the mountain. Clara dropped the wet shirts into the basket and sprinted for the cabin. She threw open the heavy door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She grabbed the Winchester from its rack, stuffing a handful of heavy brass cartridges into the pocket of her canvas skirt. As she stepped back out onto the porch, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a rifle shot tore through the serene valley. It didn't come from the trail. It came from the high ridge to the east, the direction Caleb had gone. Clara gasped, the rifle feeling suddenly heavy in her sweating hands. "Caleb!" she screamed, the wind snatching the word from her lips. A moment later, the deep, booming roar of Caleb's heavy Sharps buffalo rifle answered the first shot. A firefight had broken out in the timber. Then Clara heard the sound that turned the blood in her veins to ice. Down the main trail, emerging from the dense pine forest, rode 3 men. They were heavily armed, their horses lathered with sweat from the hard climb. Leading them was Sheriff Brody, the silver star on his chest glinting maliciously in the morning sun. And riding directly behind him, wrapped in a thick wool coat and carrying a double-barreled shotgun across her lap, was Martha Jenkins. Martha halted her horse at the edge of the clearing, her dark, hateful eyes locking onto Clara standing on the porch with the rifle. A cruel, triumphant smile stretched across the older woman's weathered face. "Hello, little bird," Martha called out, her voice echoing over the roar of the creek. "Did you really think you could hide my gold from me twice?" Clara raised the Winchester, racking the lever with a sharp, metallic clatter. Her hands, which had trembled violently the last time she faced this woman, were now as steady as the granite cliffs surrounding her home. "You aren't taking him," Clara yelled back, her voice ringing with the fierce, wild authority of the mountains. "And you aren't taking me." Sheriff Brody's roan gelding danced nervously, tossing its head as the echo of Clara's defiance bounced off the high granite walls of the valley. Brody let out a low, patronizing chuckle, shifting his weight in the saddle. He rested his hand casually on the walnut grip of his Colt revolver. "Now, Clara," Brody called out, using the sickly sweet tone he reserved for drunk miners who owed him money. "Don't do anything foolish. Your ma just wants what's rightfully hers. Put the Winchester down. And maybe I won't have to lock you up for aiding a wanted fugitive." "Caleb isn't a fugitive," Clara yelled, her voice trembling not from fear, but from a potent volcanic rage she had suppressed for 19 years. "You and my mother murdered my father. Caleb told me everything." Brody's smile vanished instantly. He cast a sharp, venomous glance over his shoulder at Martha. The old woman's face had drained of color, but her dark eyes burned with a desperate madness. "I told you the brute was alive," Martha hissed to the two hired guns flanking Brody. Rough, scarred men named Wade and Coogan, brought up from the Badlands for a cut of the silver. "Don't just sit there. Take the cabin. Get that map from her." Wade spurred his horse forward, drawing his revolver with a loud yell. Clara didn't hesitate. Caleb had taught her not to flinch. She tracked Wade's chest with the iron sights, let out half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared, kicking hard against her shoulder. She missed Wade's chest, but the heavy brass bullet tore through the leather of his saddle horn and grazed his thigh. Wade screamed, hauling back on the reins so violently his horse reared up, sending him tumbling into the slushy spring mud near the woodpile. Brody cursed, drawing his Colt and firing 2 rapid shots at the porch. Splinters of oak exploded just inches from Clara's head. She ducked instinctively, scrambling behind the thick, stacked cords of firewood Caleb had prepared for the winter. "Coogan, circle around the creek," Brody shouted, dismounting and taking cover behind a massive pine stump. "Keep her pinned down." High up on the eastern ridge, the firefight had suddenly gone deathly quiet. Caleb Wyatt lay flat on his stomach in the damp pine needles, the barrel of his heavy Sharps rifle resting on a mossy boulder. When he had first heard the horses, he had rushed to cut them off, only to be ambushed by a third hired gun, a tracker named Boone, who had been sent ahead to scout the high ground. Boone was currently lying 10 yards behind Caleb, his throat crushed by a single devastating blow from the stock of Caleb's rifle. Caleb hadn't wanted to fire his weapon and alert the main party, but Boone had managed to get a shot off first. Now, Caleb heard the unmistakable, rapid crack, crack, crack of the Winchester 1873 from the valley floor. Clara. A primal, terrifying roar tore from Caleb's chest. He didn't bother trying to navigate the winding game trail. He vaulted over the boulder, sliding and crashing down the steep, treacherous scree slope of the ridge. He moved with the chaotic, unstoppable momentum of a rock slide, his massive wolfskin coat making him look like a mythical beast descending upon the valley. Branches tore at his face and clothes, but he felt nothing. Only the agonizing, singular thought that the woman he had sworn to protect was under fire. Down by the cabin, Coogan had waded through the freezing waters of the creek, using the high bank to shield his approach. He crept up the side of the cabin, pressing his back against the logs, inching toward the front porch where Clara was pinned down. He cocked his revolver, a cruel grin spreading across his face. Clara was focused entirely on the tree line, trying to keep Brody from advancing. She jacked another round into the chamber, her breathing ragged. She didn't hear Coogan's boots on the wet porch boards. "Drop it, little bird," Coogan sneered, stepping into view, his gun aimed directly at the back of Clara's head. Clara froze, her finger hovering over the trigger of the Winchester. She slowly turned her head, staring down the black barrel of the outlaw's gun. The world seemed to move in agonizingly slow motion, but before Coogan could pull the trigger, the roof of the attached woodshed groaned under a sudden, massive weight. Caleb dropped from the low overhang like a thunderbolt. He didn't use a weapon. He landed directly behind Coogan, his massive, leather-gloved hands wrapping around the outlaw's shoulders and neck. With a raw grunt of exertion, Caleb hoisted the grown man off his feet and hurled him backward. Coogan crashed into the heavy oak door of the cabin, the sickening crack of his skull hitting the wood echoing over the rush of the creek. He slumped to the porch, completely unconscious. Clara gasped, dropping the Winchester and throwing herself backward as Caleb stepped in front of her. He was breathing heavily, his beard dusted with pine needles and dirt, a shallow cut bleeding freely down his left cheek. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his blue eyes frantically scanning her for blood. "No," Clara choked out, grabbing the thick wool of his sweater. "I'm okay, but Brody and Martha are out there, and another man by the woodpile." Caleb's eyes darkened, turning from the color of glacial ice to the color of a furious winter storm. He scooped up the Winchester from the floorboards, chambered around with a terrifying fluidity, and stepped out from the cover of the porch. "Brody," Caleb's voice boomed across the clearing, possessing a booming resonance that seemed to vibrate the very ground. Behind the pine stump, Sheriff Brody peered out, his face draining of blood. The stories of the mountain man's survival were true. Standing on the porch, rifle in hand, Caleb Wyatt looked exactly like the vengeful ghost Brody had spent 19 years trying to drink away. Martha, who had stayed mounted near the edge of the trees, let out a shriek of pure panic. She raised her double-barreled shotgun, aiming wildly at the porch. "Shoot him, Brody. Shoot him now," Martha screamed, her horse prancing nervously beneath her. Brody, paralyzed by a potent mixture of guilt and sheer terror, raised his Colt with a shaking hand. He fired blindly. The bullet grazed Caleb's left ribs, tearing through the heavy wool sweater and carving a shallow groove in his flesh. Caleb didn't even flinch. He didn't break stride. He walked slowly, deliberately down the steps of the porch, raising the Winchester to his shoulder. "This is for Elias," Caleb said softly, though the words carried perfectly in the sudden, breathless silence of the valley. He fired once. The heavy bullet shattered Brody's right collarbone. The corrupt sheriff screamed, dropping his revolver into the mud as the impact spun him around and dropped him flat on his back. He clutched his shoulder, thrashing in the dirt, completely neutralized. Wade, seeing his boss drop and the other two men out of commission, threw his hands in the air from behind the woodpile. "I quit. I ain't dying for no boarding house hag. I yield." Martha Jenkins was suddenly, entirely alone. She sat atop her horse, the heavy shotgun trembling in her hands. She looked at the blood bleeding through Caleb's sweater, then looked at Clara, who had stepped out onto the porch, her chin held high, unafraid. "You ungrateful wretch." Martha spat at Clara, tears of absolute fury tracking through the dust on her wrinkled face. "I gave you life. I fed you. And you sighed with this wild animal to steal my fortune. It was never yours," Clara said, her voice ringing clear and steady. She walked down the steps, stopping beside Caleb. She didn't hide behind him anymore. She stood shoulder to shoulder with him. "It belonged to my father. The father you murdered. You aren't my mother, Martha. You're just a thief who got caught." Martha let out a guttural scream, swinging the twin barrels of the shotgun directly at Clara's chest. Her fingers tightened on the triggers. Caleb moved to block her, but he didn't need to. "Pull it," Clara said, her gray eyes locking onto Martha's dark ones with a chilling, absolute calm. "If you shoot me, Caleb will tear you apart with his bare hands before you can reload. If you shoot him, I will pick up his rifle and put a bullet through your heart. You have no way out of this valley, Martha. It's over." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the wind rushing through the ancient pines. Martha stared into her daughter's eyes and saw something she had never anticipated, a reflection of the unforgiving frontier itself. Clara was no longer the fragile, easily bruised girl scrubbing floors in Silver Bow. She was a woman forged by the winter, hardened by truth, and protected by the mountain itself. Martha's shoulders slumped. The heavy shotgun slipped from her grasp, clattering harmlessly to the damp earth. She buried her face in her hands and began to sob, a pathetic, broken sound that elicited no pity from either Caleb or Clara. 2 days later, Caleb and Clara rode down into the neighboring jurisdiction of Redstone, a booming cattle town far beyond the reach of Silver Bow's corruption. Tied to their pack mules were Martha Jenkins, Sheriff Brody, and the 2 surviving hired guns. They handed them over to United States Marshal Cole Davies, presenting the assayer's report, Caleb's testimony, and a written confession Brody had penned in a desperate bid to avoid the hangman's noose. The law moved swiftly in the territory. Martha was sentenced to the territorial penitentiary for murder, and Brody for corruption and attempted murder. When it was all over, Caleb and Clara stood on the wooden boardwalk of Redstone. The spring sun was warm, and the streets were bustling with life. Caleb looked down at Clara. His ribs were tightly bandaged, his face bruised, but his blue eyes were softer, warmer than they had ever been. He reached into his coat and pulled out the folded, rumpled marriage certificate Judge Harmon had hastily stamped back in January. "I reckon," Caleb rumbled, his voice thick with a sudden, uncharacteristic nervousness, "this piece of paper did its job. Martha's locked away. You're free, Clara. You have the gold from the strike. You can go east. Buy a fancy house in Boston or New York. Live the life your father wanted for you." He held the paper out to her. Clara looked at the paper, then up at the towering, quiet mountain man who had risked his life, not once but twice, to save hers. She reached out, but she didn't take the certificate. Instead, she took his large, calloused hand, weaving her fingers firmly through his. "My father didn't want the East," Clara smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that took Caleb's breath away. "He wanted a ranch in Montana, a legacy, and I can't run a ranch by myself." Caleb stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs harder than it had during the gunfight. "You want to stay with me?" "Caleb Wyatt," she whispered, stepping into his chest and resting her head against the wolfskin coat that had once shielded her from the winter. "I want you to take me home." Caleb wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her hair. The ghost of Elias Jenkins was finally put to rest, leaving behind a foundation of gold, but more importantly, a bond forged in the fires of the wildest frontier. The Whispering Ridge strike yielded enough pure silver and gold to buy 3,000 acres of prime grazing land in the rolling foothills of Montana. The boarding house drudge of Silver Bow vanished into history, replaced by Clara Wyatt, a formidable, deeply respected matriarch of the frontier who could ride, rope, and shoot as well as any cowhand on her payroll. Beside her, an immovable fixture of quiet strength, stood Caleb. He traded his wolfskin coat for a rancher's duster, but his piercing blue eyes never lost their fierce, protective edge. Their love wasn't born from soft poetry or parlor courtship. It was violently carved from the unforgiving Dakota ice, paid for in blood, and sealed by a desperate rescue. Sometimes, salvation doesn't arrive with a badge. Sometimes, it walks out of a blizzard, buys your freedom with a sack of raw gold, and quietly gives you the whole world.